Hello, 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 and good afternoon. Give folks a few minutes to get on in here this afternoon for our webinar. Thank you guys for joining us. We are looking forward to a fun conversation. It's already been fun, right, guys?
Yeah.
It's already been fun, so we're going to keep it fun. All right. Come on in if you're looking for the Brandon Hall Group webinar on Connect Strategy and Reality with Litmos. You are in the right place. Well, I tell you, Jen, they've become some of my favorite people. I probably don't know them as well as you do, but I'm excited to have them here too. The chat is up and running and available. So is the QA panel. You can submit questions as we go. So very good. All right. I think we've leveled off a little bit. Don't have like 25 people joining at once. So I think we will go ahead and launch in here. Good afternoon and welcome to Connect Strategy. Nice. We're off to a good start. Let's try that again.
It's good.
Connect Strategy and Reality, aligning business priorities and learners' needs. The Brandon Hall Group webinar in partnership with my friends at Litmos. Really excited to have Adele Pfister and Ryan Morris from the Litmos team with me today. Adele Pfister has 12 plus years experience in the instructional design world, specifically focused on learning strategy, learning management system operations, and e-learning design. Her latest passion is flexing her design skills to become a champion of making memorable training experiences by delivering meaningful learning products. She loves taking a consulting approach with projects and hopes all learners go home feeling valued and supported in their role. And thank you so much, Adele, for being here. Looking forward to our time together. And Ryan Morris, who is an LMS administrator with Litmos, has actually been with Litmos since 2018. His responsibilities have shifted a little bit since then, but he's always remained focused on helping Litmos customers find success. His latest role as LMS administrator lets him push the limits of the product, something he always encouraged while serving as a customer enablement manager. Ryan still lives by his customer first creed as a guest speaker in Litmos Labs, oftentimes showcasing how he solves internal training challenges. When he isn't exploring new ways to bend the product, you can find him in some far-flung place, soaking up everything it has to offer. And he's graciously agreed to stay engaged since he's got a pretty big trip coming up. So thanks, Ryan. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
All right. And we want to thank, of course, our sponsor today, Litmos. Litmos develops learning solutions for top performing companies. They're an established leader in the market since 2007. Litmos offers the world's easiest to use LMS and a comprehensive learning content library. Thousands of companies trust the solutions to create, curate, and connect learning content to employees, customers, and partners. The solutions are used by more than 30 million people in 150 countries across 35 languages. You can learn more about all that Litmos does on their website at litmos.com. And if you're here and you're new to Brandon Hall Group, we have several ways that we partner with organizations to empower excellence in those organizations. We are a research and analyst firm. We focus on understanding how companies are approaching all areas of the employee life cycle with a pretty big focus on learning and development, but all other areas as well. Right now, our Technology Excellence Awards and Education Technology Excellence Awards, which is new for us this year, are both open for submissions. You can learn more about those programs at excellenceawards.brandonhall.com. And the heart of what we do is research. We do have a couple of surveys that are open and active on our site right now. We are getting ready to launch our employee experience survey later this month. You can always find open survey links on our website as well. And I think I'm done with the commercials. for now. So thanks for that. Thanks for sitting through that. Happy to jump in here. This is going to be a little bit different if we do it right than your average webinar. So we are looking not to teach at you or talk at you, but to talk with each other and talk with you and walk you through how things get done. So to that end, make liberal use of our engagement capability here. You're already checking out the chat, so thank you for that. I see we've got folks from all over, including from as far away as Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which is one of the coolest cities I've ever been to. So thank you for joining us from Malaysia, because that's a 12-hour time difference from where I'm sitting. So that's amazing. We're grateful to have you here. There is also a question and answer panel available to you in your screen. So as we go, if a question occurs to you, please drop it in that question panel, just so we make sure we see it. If you put a question in the chat, we'll try to get to it, but that chat screen rolls pretty quick and we might miss it. So if you'll put it in that Q&A panel, that would be really helpful for us. And also, if you'll do me a favor and indulge me for a second, there is also a raise hand button on your screen, and we're going to play around with that a little bit later on. Can you guys test that out for me and just hit that button? Let me see those hands go up. Love it. Love it. This is a smart group, guys. I think we're going to have a good day. All right. And then we will have some polls throughout. We'll have a poll or two that will come up during the course of the conversation today. So please engage with those polls as well. You will also at the end, you'll be getting a recording as well as a PDF of the slide deck within a couple of hours after we wrap up today. So don't stress about trying to do screenshots and all that kind of stuff. You will get copies of everything that we discussed today. All right. And with that, we're going to jump right in here. So our topic today is really that perennial focus of learning professionals. Is how do we show that what we're doing is impacting the business? And how do we show beyond what we all can organically point to, which is who did the training and whether or not they passed it, to the fact that we are really impacting our business for the better. And that's really where we want to start today. So we're going to get started actually with a polling question right out of the gate. So the question is, how aligned is your learning organization with supporting the needs of the business? Very aligned, sort of aligned, or not really aligned? And so Melissa, my partner in crime from Brendan Hall Group, has launched that poll. It should be up on your screen now. Go ahead and drop your vote in there. What do you guys think we're going to see with the answers to this poll, Ryan and Adele?
I'm going to go with the lower half. I'm going to say somewhat aligned or not aligned. It's really common, and that's okay.
Whenever I do surveys, no matter the survey, I usually go for the one that's like right beneath the highest level one. So I'm thinking that everyone's going to say that they're aligned, but they're not as aligned as they could be. Because that's how I would think about it. If I was going to answer this question, I would say, well, we're aligned, not very aligned, but we're aligned.
Sure. And I'm curious, because I think if I answered honestly from my last position where I was in an organization involved with the learning function, I probably, if I were going to be honest, I'd be on the lower end, because it was a very large, very complex organization, and the learning function was kind of disjointed when I got there, and we were working on it. All right, Melissa, let's see those results. Oh, look at that. It's a bell curve.
A beautiful bell curve.
Adele wins, though. Adele wins.
Adele wins. That might be the theme of the day. All right, so let's take a look at how respondents to our Brandon Hall Group Learning and Development Benchmarking Survey answered this question. And you'll see it's kind of a bell curve, but it's a little skewed to the left on our broader survey. So this was from our 2023 Learning and Development Benchmarking Study, where we have very aligned at 23% and aligned at 55%. We were 39% aligned on the poll respondents on our webinar today, and about 9% very aligned. So I have a question for this 48% of you who said you're very aligned or aligned. I want to know if you can prove it. So raise your hand if you can prove how aligned you are. Oh, I see hands going up. I'm impressed.
Yes.
And what we're hoping to do today is, wherever you are, let's just move that needle just a little bit. Let's go up one level. How does that sound, guys? Like a reasonable goal?
That's
I like
pretty reasonable.
Yeah. All right. The other quick data point I wanted to put out here with you guys is, to what extent does your organization measure the impact of learning on organizational or individual performance? This is also from our benchmarking survey from this year. And what you'll see here is a range of responses from we don't evaluate learning impact at all to we collect data and assess how that specific learning content has impacted organizational performance or individual job performance, and everywhere in between. So what this data is telling us is this connecting of strategy to reality is the challenge. It is the spot where we as learning professionals need to really learn how to do better. What do you think, guys?
Yeah, I mean, it's been the case since the day I can remember stepping into my first class around instructional design, and the capstone class is ROI, right? And that was 13, 14, 15 years ago. So it's always been important, and it probably always will be important.
Mm-hmm. And measuring impact is not running reports out of your LMS. I'm just going to go ahead and make that statement for everyone. I'm learning that. Anyone else who's in a role similar to mine, you probably already know that. But simply running reports out of your LMS, that doesn't measure impact.
No, it's great for audits. That's
Right.
usually
The good news in all of this is it can be done. And there is a method to the madness. So we're going to introduce a method. And we want you to walk away today with feeling confident that you can go start having these conversations with your partners in your organization to help build that connection as strongly as possible. So rather than a ton of slides with a ton of points on it, we actually are going to pick a scenario, and the three of us are going to lay it out. We're going to work it out. We're going to connect the dots in real time. So as we go through, if you have other thoughts to add, other questions that are meaningful to the topic, you weigh in on those in the chat or send those through in the question panel, and we will do that. But we're gonna give you a scenario. We aligned pretty quickly that this is a really common scenario, but it's important to know that this scenario is just the one we picked.
Yeah.
So you probably have your own scenario that you're dealing with right now. So you might want to have that in mind as we jump into this conversation. So let's get started with the scenario that we chose, which is sales training refresher on solutions-based selling. So something I think we've all heard a little bit about in our lives as learning professionals, right? So some facts about the situation here. It's a current sales staff is the scope of the audience. It's about 2,500 people. Business wants it done in the next 60 days. And the reason for it is we're just out of the first quarter, and the team has not closed enough deals, and they're behind their plan for the year. So our goal today is to ensure that the training that we roll out to address the solutions-based selling refresher is fully aligned to the business and to the learners. So this is how most requests show up, isn't it, Adele? So what would you do first?
Well, I'd first start out I'd be talking and building relationships with my stakeholders, right? You need to know really, and sometimes it can be hard, but if you come with like what's in it for them, right, which we've all heard a million times, but the reason we keep saying it is because how truly valuable it is. Like, you need to align with your stakeholders, figure out what the problem really is. Maybe there's, and my biggest thing is, once I meet with stakeholders, I then like to go straight to the horse's mouth. So I would also be starting to just build those relationships. You're not going to build a relationship overnight. Maybe you're working very quickly in your time, you've got a time crunch, but you're going to start planting seeds, right, for your journey and this learning experience you need to create. Or maybe you're not even to the point where it's a learning experience. It could be a communication, it could be a behavior change. So getting to know what the problem really is and starting to plant those seeds so you can build relationships, if they're not already there, with key players in the game. And that includes learners too. I think oftentimes that gets a little overlooked in this part. When we're gathering data, we want to go, it's great to go to your leadership team, but what I found over the last 12 years is you're going to get the best data from the people who are in the day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep, very true. So in that spirit, let's think a little bit about, and I've seen it come up across the chat bot a little bit too here, chat box a little bit about, is training really the answer? Is that really the problem? And of course, you're going to ask that question. So we're going to, for sake of our conversation, we're going to assume that training is a part of the solution here. Other problems that we've thought about. So here's a little more information on the scenario, right? 5% of the sales reps are new hires in the past year. So that's, go back and do the math. That's 500 people that are new within the last 12 months. And they've also implemented a new CRM since the beginning of the year. So that are within the last year. What are some other areas that you might look for what's really going on here? If you're in the chat, if you guys have some thoughts about what other places you would look, what other questions might you ask? Brian, what else would you look for in terms of getting to the root of the problem?
Well, you really have to take a step back, and this is where meeting with those stakeholders really comes into play, because what else about the sales organization has changed? If they implemented a new CRM, are there new territories? Are there language barriers? Is there an enablement barrier? And I think it also begs the question, what is the difference between training and enablement? Because they're two separate things. What sort of track record do existing salespeople have? What do the most successful salespeople, what do they do? Can we capture that and use it to train new and existing salespeople to be better at what their job is? We're talking about things not only from a practical standpoint, so the tools that you're going to use every single day, but also from a more emotional and theoretical standpoint. How do you go about selling?
Yeah, and there's some great stuff flying through the chat. So I've seen everything from, go back to onboarding for that 5% that's new, right? What is the process? Is the process documented? Does everybody know what the process is? Do people know what the targets are? Do they know what those expectations are? How do those results compare to previous years? Also, all good points. Let's see. Anything else you guys caught that maybe I missed coming through the chat?
Well, there was a few things, and I just want to really bridge the gap too, from what I said to what Brian said. It was kind of beautiful there is, your leadership's really important in helping you, like what you hear from your actual sales reps, the folks that are in the day in and day out. You're going to bridge that gap to like, what are they seeing, doing, feeling, and how does that tie into what my leadership is telling me the overall business goal or the overall business gap is? Like, how are we going to bridge that gap, right? And I did see something about like, what if your stakeholders don't know? I feel like the key to tying in and having successful learning experiences that you can then track and collect data on to show success is you're continuously, sometimes to an annoying degree, asking a ton of questions to everyone, and you're trying to bring out that why. You're just being a little detective, and sometimes you know the answer to the question, but you're asking your leadership team so they have a moment to pause and reflect, and then have that aha moment for themselves.
Yep. I think that's a great point. And I think as we step in and now we start to work this problem, we're going to show exactly how that thought process unfolds, right? So we are kind of anchoring ourselves here from a thought process perspective to the learning performance convergence model, which was developed by Brandon Hall Group to show how the three elements of the 70-20-10 model, which there's a lot of opinion and a lot of strong feelings about that 70-20-10 model. It is just a point of reference for this particular model. And the thing that I want to reinforce for our folks here is we are not advocates of a strict adherence to that 70-20-10 model. It was never really meant to be used that way, but it is a good place to start from the think through perspective. And this model shows how you connect learning to performance. And it was born out of multiple studies that we conducted over the last few years. So you'll have a copy of this in the deck that you receive, and we're going to actually break down and look at each of these in turn. So we start at the very beginning, which is what are the business outcomes that we are hoping to address? So we have touched a little bit on this already in our time together, Ryan and Adele, but what are some ways that we can focus in on what those business outcomes are? We started with, we know we're behind plan. Okay, so now what?
Well, we have to.
That's a loaded question there, Matt. That's a loaded question.
We have to go back to, I know I said the word annoying earlier, but I really like you're only like pesky to a point, and then your stakeholders have this aha moment. And they're like, oh my God, okay, now we're on the same page. So one, you have to do your homework. You have to sit down with stakeholders and leadership and really figure out whether it's revenue, whether it's we need to save time, which is usually linked to some sort of profit margin, whether, like Ryan spoke to, enablement, what do we need in order to increase and improve performance? Where is that happening? And usually that's done through a few different assessments, right? Target audience assessment, your needs assessment. And if you're not familiar with those, I highly encourage you to Google them very quickly, and it'll give you a nice little layout of the land. And so that's where you're going to find out what these outcomes are. And then you usually start, I typically, and Ryan might work a little bit differently, so I'll let him chime in a second, but typically I kind of reverse engineer. Like, I'll get the overall business goal, I'll get the overall business outcomes, and then I start reverse engineering from there. So what are these outcomes, and what needs to happen in order for these outcomes to really happen and be impactful to improve them, right? Ryan, I'll give you a second to kind of piggyback that.
Yeah, and it's like a full piggyback, because I do this basically the same thing, but I think about it a little bit differently. So I still start with the business outcome. So what does the business want to achieve? And then I start asking those same stakeholders and other learning champions in the organization, why do we need that outcome? And then once I start digging into why we need that outcome, then I can start asking what's preventing us from getting to that outcome, which then helps me understand what sort of learning experience we need to think about to solve the problem that lets us get to the outcome.
That's why we make it.
Yes, and I think we want to focus, at the start of this process is you start from the beginning is really what are we driving to in the business? Because that has to stay kind of front and center, because we're learning people. We're high energy. We're super creative. We love to do fun things, and we can take ourselves down a path of a really great, fun experience, and we missed the boat on the actual business impact, right? So definitely begin with the end in mind. I saw that floating around in the chat as well, and that's 100% what we're talking about. What are those business outcomes? And then once we have kind of a clarity around that, and it's important, we're differentiating here from the learning outcomes. We're not talking about learning objectives yet. We're not, we're just really specifically focused on that business outcome piece. So then what comes next? So next up comes those individual outcomes. So what is it individually that the employee, the learner, the teammate, the salesperson in our scenario, what is it that needs to happen for them? And that is where it starts to get really fun.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you got to think of it, you're creating this roadmap, right? I feel like we're always creating roadmaps for the learning experience, but knowing what that previous slide, that outcome is, that business outcome that we want to impact, that's your North Star, right? That's your guiding light. And that's how you're going to be able to keep, as long as you're keeping that in mind through your learning experience, you're going to have success. No matter what the modality is, when you start collecting data, you're going to have success. Tying back to that outcome, right? So then we've got the individual outcomes. That's again, as good learning leaders, we're constantly doing our homework and we're constantly asking questions. And we have a wide variety of audiences that we need to keep in mind, because sometimes it's not just the target audience. Like, is IT involved in this? What steps do they have? Like, you really need to look at the whole spider web for what it is and figure out where all those resources fit in and what is realistic too when you're creating these individual outcomes. Like you were saying, Matt, we could create this amazing experience that's really fun and creative, but do we have the resources to do that? Who else are we impacting when we do that? What's the reality of the situation when we start building out these individual outcomes so that we can show the business we succeeded at the end of the line. And I love working with Ryan, because let me tell you, Ryan is one of the best problem solvers I've ever worked with. And it's because he asks the best questions. We just did it this morning, and I feel like that's part of like one of the most important pieces of this process is, what questions are you asking? Who are you asking them to? And why are you asking them? What do you want to gain from your conversations?
And sort of the internal conversation that I have with myself all the time is a lot of times when we're in learning and development or in training, people come to us because they need us to be experts about something. And I'm not an expert about this sales process. What's in place? What do we have? How does an individual outcome contribute to the business outcome? So reminding myself that I need to ask those questions because I don't know everything is a really great place to start, because you learn as you go. And that's why I love being in learning anyway, is because I get to find out and become an expert in all these different areas. So always coming from that place of not knowing will really help you ask better questions of these learning champions that I keep talking about. And by the way, like engaging with these people and talking to them and asking them these things is how you get them on your side, which is what you need once you finally get to like close to the final step. When you're launching this training, you need them to be excited about what you're doing so that they help drive that excitement on their teams.
And I think what asking ourselves at this stage, all right, what should happen to this individual's performance after participating in this training once we're at that solution phase, right? What happens in the business because this individual's performance got better for themselves and also for the organization. I think too, I'd love your take on this, guys. How do you make this process as efficient as possible. So to Adele, your point earlier about we ask questions to the point of annoyance and try not to cross that line.
Yeah.
What are some things that you guys do to help minimize that? Because it can begin to feel that way for a business leader who's like, look, just do the training and fix it,
Yeah.
which we all hear every day, right?
I do a lot of prep work before I have a conversation with a leader. That's number one. Or at least try to. I try to do my homework before I show up, right? And I try to be very focused around, okay, what do I not know that is relevant to a leader? I'm not going to go to a leader and say, tell me the specific process and how it works and how would you get to a quote in Salesforce, right? I'm not going to go to a leader and ask that question. I want to be really focused around what's relevant to them based on what I need to know. So I want to be really strategic when I'm speaking to them. And it's the same for the learners as well, right? Like you got to know your audience. You got to read the room, you got to know your audience. And there is a plan, right? So I do take each and every time I take the systematic approach of instructional design. And as nerdy as that sounds, that's pretty much been my basis for the last 12 years. As I go in and I read the room and I say, okay, this person needs a survey. This leader needs a FaceTime and a full-on interview. This leader has very little time. I'm shooting them an email with very, very specific questions. So I take that systematic approach, and the same goes for the learners as well. I take a moment of my own time, so I'm not taking others' time, to really think about what their day in and day out is like. And I base my systematic approach around those findings. And Ryan has his own style as well. And I know it's very successful because he gets stuff done all the time.
Well, I just have to say that like Adele's approach it's brilliant. And if you don't know about it, then just Google like the systematic approach to instructional design, because just in like working with her for the last 7 months, I mean, I've gone from like just kind of like organically coming to things to having a process. And when you talk about Matt asking, you know, how do you make this efficient as possible? You know, there's a system to it. And, you know, a lot of the questions are going to be the same across the board, but you might tweak them depending on who your audience is, where in leadership they sit, and really figuring out what's important to that leader, because what's important to a sales manager is going to be completely different than what's important to the VP of sales.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we had a great question come through on the Q&A about, when you have leaders with big ideas, how do you help temper and create alignment for delivering to the business? And so I think we've been touching on that, and I see you guys smiling because I know you know the person who asked this question. So, so I think the more systematic and intentional you can be, and when you have those, especially if there are leaders in the organization who haven't yet figured out that there is a method to the madness of what a learning team delivers. And I know that it seems odd in 2023 to say that there's still those leaders out there, but those leaders are still out there, and they are still big influencers in your organization. And so the more disciplined that you can be and the more intentional you can be makes a difference in that. What else have you seen work with that leader that, you know, says we need to bring all the salespeople in from all over the country for 5 days of training to fix this?
Yeah, that usually I go straight to like, well, that sounds really amazing. And we have to look at our resources. I have to be that person that says, well, let's look at our resources right now. And then I try to stay optimistic with trying to stay really agile, right? So then the agile approach comes. There's multiple systems coming into this approach that I use over the last 12 years. I've been grateful to be with tech companies who I've just kind of been able, and Ryan too, we've just been on kind of the fringe of using agile or using the agile technique. Continuous improvement comes to mind, especially after being in the manufacturing industry for a little while. And you have to be able to say, that is wonderful. And here's our resources. How do we use an agile approach to at least meet you in the middle, or we'll get like, let's not lose sight of the long game. And if we are playing a long game, how do we have rapid deliverables in between that are going to excite everyone and really add value to their role? Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, right? Good learning leaders are going to add value to the day-to-day while aligning with good business impact and using their resources correctly and not making people wait. And it's a dance. It's like, Ryan's a theater major, and I could have asked for a better partner in crime because he knows how to coordinate and choreograph. And it really is, you're choreographing, you're road mapping all at the same time. And so you do have to stay flexible and be able to have the hard conversations with leaders. Like, let's look at our resources and how can I meet you in the middle and still make you happy with that wonderful idea.
And most of the people sitting at that level, if any of them were to say, I want to fly our entire sales team or customer success team or whatever the team is anywhere for 5 days, I would just say, well, that is really expensive. I think I can save you a little money if we just rethink the way we're going to help them have this experience so that they enjoy their jobs, so that they enjoy their team, so that they're more productive. So I always try to be as political as I can. And if there's one thing leaders love, it's hearing you say that you can help them save money.
100%. And I do want to call out too in the chat, we had Amy throw into the mix here that knowing that if we're driving towards behavioral change or a technical issue, technical skills can also affect some of those practical decision making. But I think that's all great advice on how to keep those big leaders, those leaders with the big ideas, focused on the end game. What are we really after here?
Yeah.
Right. And so once we know that business impact and we know how the individual participants can help impact that outcome, now we're ready to say, okay, for those that we are going to put through training, what do those objectives look like? And what's the connection point between those team members and the business need that's driving the training? So anything that you guys want to add about sort of that piece before we, the next big step is then what's this learning experience going to look like, right? So we're building each of those building blocks, pulling all of that together, starting with that business and then the individual performance. And now we're at the point of, okay, what are we doing in this training experience, whatever that ends up being, whatever we're targeted on?
I think we're ready. Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, I just, since you brought up my theater background, I just am reminded from Rocky Horror Picture Show when Dr. Frankenfurter says, I'll correct the cause, but not the symptom. Remember that the symptoms are the things that get picked apart in individual learning experiences. But what we're really driving for here with these conversations with leaders is helping to define the cause of those symptoms. That's what we want to correct.
Yeah,
and that's
showing
why
them
theater is here to save the world.
Yeah, and showing them, where that either adds value or takes away value from the business, right? Kind of, and talking about Jen's wonderful experience that she wants to fly everyone out, like you said, Matt. Okay, that sounds great, and does this add value? And it proved to me that this is going to add value, and the cause is going to do the same thing. If we can find the cause, we can start to add value by solving for the cause.
Very good. And I saw somebody in there say theater majors make great trainers. I think that's true. Stage managers make great project managers. Also true. And I will let people in on a little secret. I was a music major, and here I am.
What?
So
we didn't know this. This is news to us. So
I'm music majors make really good pilots and speakers. So here we go. I hope I'm doing it right with that. Making it obvious. All right. So when we start talking then about the learning experience, there's a couple of different components here, right? And we go back to our learning performance convergence model. We said it was built off kind of that 70-20-10 framework of the world. It's also broken down between that sort of formal approach, informal approach, experiential approach, super broad, big buckets, just idea starters, not hard and fast percentages. The kicker here is when we start now contextualizing, we know who these learners are, we know what's behind, we know, to Ryan's point, what's the cause of the issue, and we know what we're trying to move towards in terms of performance in the business. Now we can start talking about, what does this learning experience look like? What's the modality? What's the approach? How do we break it down? So you start building those learning scenarios. What are some ways that you guys recommend that we start building out what that learning experience will be based on what we've learned so far in the process?
Sure. So we're going to hypothetically assume that we have created some very focused learning objectives based off of our target audience analysis, our needs assessments, all our questions with leadership. We've gotten to the root of the cause. We have created some learning objectives to try and fill that gap that is, from point A to point B. And so once we have those learning objectives, we're going to start building out our experience. And the old me would have said training or e-learning or whatever, a little more specific, but I like to go with these days because it's experiences that people really remember. And again, it's not always going to be training. Like, I think for this one, Ryan, we were discussing how it would probably be a blended approach. There's some enablement involved, like that enablement, like you said, it's not always synonymous with training. I think that's 100% solid. So we're going to figure out from those learning objectives and goal statements, we're going to choose our modality. And in this case, it's going to be blended. Again, the approach blended, the learner experience. At the end of the day, we want our sales folks to feel really confident in the tools they're using. We want them to know why they're doing what they're doing. And then we want to be able to prove that we were successful in doing so, right? So we're creating yet another roadmap, which is really common in this systematic approach. You kind of have multiple roadmaps. You got one for stakeholders, one for the business impact, and then one for your learners. And so this will be part of their roadmap. And Ryan.
Yeah, and just to continue that thought, especially when it comes to salespeople and sales training and sales enablement, salespeople are typically like natural show people anyway, in their own right. And one of the best ways to learn something or do it better is to teach other people how you do it. So one way that I would leverage some of those learning champions that I identified earlier in my process is by asking them to help inform other people on their teams about how to best use the tools. What techniques do they use? Are we losing deals like in the prospecting phase, or are we using them on the final call, or where in between? Where are we? It's all about getting really down to the nitty gritty about, okay, well, if we're trying to increase revenue, we have to figure out where we're losing sales. And we can use where we're winning them too, but let's figure out what part of that whole sales cycle is causing the disconnect. And then how can we approach that from an experience standpoint? Do we need to listen to more calls that other successful salespeople are having? Maybe we don't need to have a 5-day, trip, but maybe we need to have a 2-day gathering where we can role play with each other, where we can go through different scenarios with one another, where we can really see each other all in the room. So I would always start with an e-learning approach, at least from a pre-work perspective, so that we get everybody on the same baseline, and then ask, okay, for these people, for my audience, how do I take that experience to the next level for them? not in my mind what I think is best, but what they tell me is best for them.
Yeah, coming back to the learner as the start of the experience building is always key, because back in the day, the dark ages, when I started in this business, it was always keep in mind the learner style. And I think we've evolved so far beyond that now, where it's not just about learning style, but it's the whole tapping into how our brains work and how our brains function and how we interact with our work as well. So if you're going to build an e-learning first approach, which I think most organizations today are in fact doing, but what are the other pieces that will help support that? The experiential component that you mentioned, all of those different pieces. And then as you start to build that experience out and you tie it back to those learning objectives that are built on top of those business outcomes and performance expectations, then you know going into it, where do I need to find, how am I going to know, which is where we're kind of headed to next. Like, how am I going to know if this is working, right? Which is what I love about the agile approach, which would have saved me so much time and energy as a young training manager back in the day, to have that ability to cycle right.
But we had to learn first, right? We had to have that experience, and the experience is where you learn. And I love that Brian brought up demos and simulations and role playing, especially given this sales specific use case, because it's the experience where we learn. And like you said, Ryan and I do this often. We do e-learning prep work because that's what our learners have access to. I know in manufacturing, that's not always the realization of your situation, but e-learning first, and then we give them a chance to practice skills in a safe space. That is so important. Practice, whatever that practice looks like, as long as learners are getting that, and you're giving them the what's in it for them, which even if it's, you get to be more confident, you get to go home happy because you had a good day, because you got through your queue faster and your boss wasn't on you about why you didn't finish your queue today. Like, that's a good day. That makes me feel good as a learning leader, that I get to help people do that. And the key there, or introducing new skill sets, is they have to be able to practice in a safe space, and they're going to get that tribal knowledge that Ryan was talking about at the same time. That's also very key, but the safe space is so important. And when we don't have time to give them that, we have to do our best to create something similar. As a learning leader, I feel very strongly about that.
And I know that everyone's probably like questioning, how do you do this in a world where so many people are remote or hybrid? There is no like silver bullet to answer that question, but some great places to start are collaborative virtual rooms or virtual meeting spaces, where you as the manager take ownership of creating those spaces and invite the people to them, schedule them. Maybe it's just for 30 minutes. Maybe we're not going to like train on anything. In fact, I encourage you to not train on anything. Just invite people to a space, encourage them to turn their cameras and their mics on and to work and talk to each other, just like you would if we were all, sitting in an office with one another.
Yeah, I think there's an important component there. There's a question in the Q&A from Christian that says, there's a huge clamor in my business for face-to-face training that I think is a red herring. Do we think that face-to-face intervention really increases learning outcomes over a blended online approach? For me, it comes down to post-intervention follow-up to see how people are applying their learning. If that isn't happening, it makes face-to-face a huge waste of money. What are your thoughts based on experience? I'll start with you, Ryan.
Well, so I'm going to speak as a learner right now. I really love reading instructions and process docs and like step by step. So you could give me e-learning and I could go through it and I could go and take the test on it and ace the test. But if you really want to measure how well I understand the concepts of that learning, I need to be given the space to talk about that with another human. So while I don't think that face-to-face training is the answer to every question, I do think that it's a component of measuring learning and understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, as much as we love face-to-face, it's like you said, it's really expensive. And I think it depends on your situation. I hate to be that person to be like, it's not me weaseling out of the answer, but it's just very true. Like, is it kinesthetic? Is your skill set that you're working on kinesthetic? Is it physical? Those are usually the only times in my last 12 years, especially since budgets have gotten smaller and the world has gotten smaller. My previous org was 5,000 people and we made air filters. And so there was a need for face-to-face training, but you had to find and train the trainer there, right? That's how you made it scalable. You couldn't be I couldn't be in 8 factories at one time. So how do I make that work? I had to train the trainer. That was one of the few times where I truly felt like face-to-face was a must because it was kinesthetic. But if it's not, then yeah, you can probably make it work in a remote hybrid setting and have the same results. You just have to be smart about it. You have to really engage your audience. You have to toy with creative interaction. And there's ways to do that. There are ways to do that. I wish I could go into that more, but I could talk on another hour on that. So.
Yeah, well, they'll find you and ask you, I'm sure, after the fact. Yeah, I agree. I think you have to contextualize your approach for your business, for your learners, for what we're talking about and how we're trying to address those issues. I think that a lot of business leaders default to face-to-face because it's what they know and it's what they understand. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. So you have to talk about the practicality and the reality of how do you make that happen, versus if we leverage the technology that we are in all likelihood already leveraging in a knowledge-first business, and apply it to a learning conversation or a learning focus that might meet some of the same kinds of needs that you're talking about. And yeah, the reality is if we're all physically sitting in the room, how much richer and how different the energy would be potentially around the conversation and around the topic. But the reality is the days of everybody being in one geography for any significant amount of time on a consistent basis just we aren't back there. And I don't know that we'll ever fully get back there, despite numerous opinions about where the future of work is taking us, right? So yeah. I think that's important. I think that, again, you come back to what are we trying to accomplish, and the proof is in the pudding, which we're going to get to in just a second. I've got one more question that's been hanging out over here for a little while. It kind of ties back to the how do you narrow the scope of the big dreamer leader who wants to blow tons of money on live training kind of thing. And really, it would be more about what about if you have the opposite issue where time and money needed to do good training just isn't there? Everything's done quickly and it's almost never done well. How do you balance that side of the equation?
Yeah, never done well. So I think that's
I should say, it doesn't say never done well. It says not always well.
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at the quality versus quantity, right? You have to be able to have the hard conversations with folks. It's happened so many times with the trainer where I'm like, this is and maybe it's even brushing up on those negotiation skills. Sometimes you're a negotiator. Yep. Sometimes you're a negotiator and you have to say, look, this is not sound, and I'm going to tell you why. If we put e-learning in front of people to put e-learning in front of people, we're going to fail. If we have a very valuable reason and a realistic behavior change that's going to come from this knowledge and come from people getting through this e-learning, okay, that sounds like a win, but let's dive into that a little more to make sure we're aligning with what the CEO wants, right? You know, I feel like a negotiator, a good part of my job.
And I always remind myself and everyone that I work with, you know, measure twice, cut once,
Yes.
because if we rush through this, now that doesn't mean that we don't establish deadlines and that we don't stick to timelines and expectations for when something is delivered. But it also doesn't mean that you should expect to have any sort of learning experience available in a week. Like no leader should expect that. Not that's going to have any sort of meaningful impact on people. And if you are in this situation, what I encourage you to do is to go and pull those reports that I was talking about earlier that don't matter. Well, I mean, they do matter, but go and pull those completion reports and say, all right, every single person in this org completed this training, and their sales managers or their managers are all saying that everyone on their team still has the problem that this training was supposed to address. So clearly, there's a problem with the learning experience that those people are having.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Need to do better.
And I think, yeah, as I'm watching the time because I'm having a blast, but we do have a limit on our time, unfortunately. So I do want to call out, there's a great comment here that says for one that they have for one of their biggest stakeholders, we can usually get her to stop and reflect with one question: how will this be measured?
I giggled
And
and
that's
got me to smile big.
yeah, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. If you come back, and now we're at the end of that model, the learning performance convergence model that we looked at, which is how do we know if it's working? Well, you know if it's working if you're measuring the right things. And if you've done the homework on the front end to get clear on those business outcomes, clear on the performance expectations, clear on the learning objectives, then the measurement becomes super easy because you look at it and go, this is where that will show up. This is where that will show up. Now, it's not as fast as completion data and LMS driven data, right? Sometimes you have to wait a cycle or two until you see if the needle actually gets moved. And I think that's an important part of the conversation as well. And Adele, I know this is near and dear to your heart. Any last thoughts on the measurement piece? Because we've got one more question I definitely want to get to.
Okay.
To wrap things up.
Yep. So I've been asked this question since I started and I was green, and I had all I had was college, right? Like I knew some things, but then I had to like go into the real world, and I had a CEO of an online retailer sitting there with the sales team, sitting there asking me, well, how are you going to prove that this works? How are you going to prove that you made impact? And so there's various ways we can do this. I know some of them, you know, you've probably all heard before, but depending on the context of the situation, ideally, if you're in this sales scenario here, they're in some sort of sales management system, right? They're in some sort of queue system that takes them through the sales journey and is capturing that. And so I would immediately start trying to bridge gaps where, okay, here's a learning objective. Does this learning objective anywhere in the sales system, is it trackable? You know, do we see quotes going out faster? Do we see contracts being closed in a smaller amount of time? Are we tracking that data in the first place? Who do I need to talk to start tracking that data if we're not? And what do I need to do to get that reporting that I need post training? And I want to be very specific around my audience. I want to be able to look at exactly who took the training. And so really getting solid data is huge. And then if you can start connecting that to any sort of ROI, that's a huge win. Now, it's not always with learning. Sometimes we don't have access to that data, and I understand that. And that's when I would start encouraging people to really start templating survey questions, interview questions with stakeholders and with your learners, checklists, you know, let's start talking to the folks who are experiencing this and who are impacted, including leaders, and really do our due diligence in what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. If we can get hard data that's really connecting the dots between what they learned and labor time or closing cases or closing a deal, if we can get that data, even better. And I know Ryan probably has some things to say here too in our last minute.
I'll just say like super quickly, we started with the overall like 10,000 foot view business objective. That's where we started. And when we were going through this whole process, when we are going to now measure our outcomes, that's where we end. But we're going to start with these team-based or department-based objectives. So baby steps lead to a long journey. So you go to the sales managers and you've identified the 5 things that they need around increased productivity. And then a month after the training, have any of these metrics improved? Maybe not. 2 months. Now maybe they're starting to see some traction. And then you're able to go to the regional managers and say, this is how the training is impacting this level of productivity. And then maybe it takes 6 months for you to get to that business outcome, but now they are running. So baby steps.
Absolutely. We are, I would love to keep this going, and we'll hang on here for another couple of minutes, but this has been a phenomenal conversation. I thank Ryan Morris and Adele Pfister from Litmos and our sponsors, Litmos, for giving us this opportunity. I thank you guys who've hung on to the end and given us great questions and great comments. I really appreciate that. Reinforcing for you guys, you will see a recording in your email, and you will see a PDF copy of the slides that we've shared. And I don't know, we got a question, Adele, about where do we get a head start on building out those templates for survey and discovery questions. So I don't know if you have any favorite spots, or if you're just saying Google it and you'll find some stuff.
I
think that's the core skill of a great learning leader, right? It's being able to Google search.
Totally where I came up with a lot of mine from years previous. Honestly, like I just started good strategy survey questions, good survey questions about learning experience, good training survey questions. Start Googling all those things and you're going to get some great feedback. But then I really encourage you too to really tap into your own inner knowledge and think about what do I want to know? What do you want to know? And ask away. And a lot of times, if you're giving people good experiences, if you're tapping into relevancy and you're not wasting their time and you're building trust with good learning, they're going to want to answer those questions for you because they appreciate what you did for them.
And if you need some help crafting those questions and you don't want to scroll through Google articles, then you can ask ChatGPT.
Oh my God, that tool.
Like it's a whole nother webinar.
It's crazy.
That's a whole other webinar. Thank you guys so much. We're going to wrap things up today. I had one question we didn't get to that I actually am going to ask Ryan and Adele to weigh in on, and we'll maybe put it out in an email follow-up as a part of the email follow-up. Because it really is an interesting question about, does it make a difference if the learning group is embedded in the business or sitting in the HR organization, as to whether or not that connectivity and that measurement is tighter? And I think that's a great, that we could probably build a whole webinar off of that one question.
Right, right.
So
that's a rabbit hole.
Food for thought for future. Thanks to everyone for their time. Thanks to Ryan and Adele. Have a great rest of your day and your week, folks.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, guys.